down to genocide. So as with our flip videos, we have a voiceover. This year we have a video over as well, just to get you that personal touch. Hope you're going all right at the moment. Hope you're staying safe and you're working on your well-being as well. Okay, let's start with genocide. So my advice for these videos would be to pause to take notes. And when I ask you to complete activities or worksheets, that you pause and complete them, then come back to this slideshow. There will also be activities at the end that I'll ask you to do, and then you can submit them on Google Classroom. So I'll give you a second to have a look at these, defining genocide. Pause and then unpause me. Okay, so you've just read what the Article 2 on the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, published in 1948, details. So essentially what we're looking at is a collection of elimination of members of a particular group, causing really savage harm to them in some way, deliberately doing so either directly against the person or people, but also working towards damaging that group as a whole as well. So it doesn't have to be death or physical damage. It could be restricting supplies, segregating them. It could be any number of things that ultimately leads to their physical destruction in the long term or the prolonged term. This also includes prevention of births in this group as well. So we do have ways as a human race to basically sterilize people, and this would count as part of the genocide definition as well. This also includes taking children from one place to another place to separate the two and ensure that they do not grow up as part of that group. So it was first coined in 1944 by Lemkin. You can see this. In 1948, most of the nations in the world signed this into force. The effectiveness of this convention is debated, and you're going to be looking at that today as well as part of this lesson. Now, genocide, considering where we have state sovereignty, can sometimes actually be undertaken by the states themselves, and sometimes they can actually be undertaken by rogue or renegade groups within the nation as well. So despite this treaty having all countries engaging and agreeing, we actually have had a number since it was agreed upon and ratified in 1948 in these 140 countries. So we've had Rwanda, which we're going to look at as part of this lesson here, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Darfur as well. So when we talk about the United Nations and the effectiveness of the UN, the Genocide Convention is brought into the discussion quite often, and that is because it's quite hard for the UN to actually intervene given its slow nature and the nature of all nations having a say, including the country that may be committing this genocide. So it's pretty full on. It gets a bit crazy when we start looking at the speed of these genocides and about how we can use a concept that was created and has been perfected over the last 60, 70 years, looking at the different stages of genocide and how we can use them to identify them early on and hopefully stop them from getting to the stage where we have the elimination of people or groups of people. So this will be an interesting question for you to look up, and there's a bit of a worksheet or a bit of an activity that I'm going to get you to do as well, but I'll direct you to that in a second. So using the definition of a genocide, you're going to be looking at whether the stolen generation was a genocide. This is important because it doesn't need to satisfy all of these dot points. It can be a part of it. So if you could stop, go to Google Classroom and have a crack at the activity there, that'd be fantastic. Submit it there. I will be checking it as per all of the worksheets, and then you can return to this video. All right, now what we're going to look at are the various stages of genocide. There are a number of documents which detail different numbers of genocide, or different stages, of genocide. And basically this is because different groups who publish these documents combine or separate out these stages depending on what they are looking at and when they are looking at it as well. Alrighty. So what we have here are the 10 stages of genocide. So I've posted this on Google Classroom. You can have a read of it. We're going to go through it together here. So, as we would when we're reading a document, we're going to be looking at, to begin with, the title. So, this is called Genocide Watch in the International Alliance to End Genocide. So, just walking you through how I would approach this. This is not actually the name of the article. This is the name of the website. Some clues are that it does say that the author here, Gregory Stanton, is the president of Genocide Watch. So it's incredibly unlikely that this title the title of this article is actually Genocide Watch. If you look down here, you see the 10 stages of genocide as the title. We notice this because of the italics. And we also know that there are a list here as well, counting them. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and then after, there is also denial as well. So let's have a look at this together and we can talk about it. So each stage signifies a different level heading towards genocide, but the process is not linear. Sometimes these stages that we look at today will actually occur simultaneously. That is, they will happen at the same time. Logically, of course, we must have these end stages, such as extermination and denial, happen towards the end. And the first ones, such as classification, symbolization, and discrimination, often happen at the beginning. But it is quite possible that classification and symbolization, as an example, happen at the same time. So let's have a look. So what we're going to look at first is classification. Now, to begin with, all cultures have categories to basically separate people into an us and them situation. All right, whether it's by religion, nationality, ethnicity, race, or some other facet of identity, nations tend to have different groups within society. Now, typically, what we have are these groups that would be working harmoniously together. They're not separated, they just have a unique identity. This is fine. Okay. Typically, we have these groups interacting with each other through work, through just social experiences, politics, religion, etc., etc. It's only a problem when we start actually using that towards separating these people and giving them names which have something attached to it as well. So, of course, we have Catholics and Christians and Jewish people, Muslim, all of these different peoples within society. Sorry, I was just reading a quote there from an article that I'll post as well. But basically, these bipolar societies, like it says in this article here under classification, like Rwanda, are the most likely to have genocide because there are two clear separate groups. There are not multiple ones, there are two. So if you have studied the Holocaust in some way or are interested in that, which I highly recommend, even if you haven't studied it, look up what happened because it's fascinating and horrific. We have the beginning of the Holocaust began with the separation of what was considered to be a German and a Jewish person. And of course, we know from history that the Jewish people were considered a scapegoat by the German Nationalist Party, or what would become the Nazis, and they used that leverage to seize power and basically justify their actions later on. This is a stage where we have an immediate preventative measure that we can use, like it says there in this article. Basically, that we want to have universalistic institutions that transcend these bipolar segregation of groups. So basically, these groups or these organizations, such as religion or politics, that allow people to mix from these groups, ultimately could stop this whole process happening as people interact with each other and they come to know the person rather than the title given to them or the name or the stereotype. Like it says here as well, is that the ethnic cleavages in Rwandan society, that is the separation of the two groups, the Tutsi and the Hutu, could have been prevented by the Catholic Church, Stanton speculates. Common language in Tanzania, shared language is really important in these countries as well. Without the language, we don't have that connection that breaks down the barrier. And as a result, we have these groups separating more and more as we see this genocide, or these 10 stages towards genocide unfold. What we have here as well is symbolization as our second step. So it's basically giving symbols or names to particular groups of people to then associate certain ideas with. So we're not quite up to the stage of discrimination yet. We're basically setting it up for discrimination. So with the Jewish people, or the gypsies, in Nazi Germany, or in the lead up to Nazi Germany, we had them separated, right? We had the yellow star for Jewish people under Nazi rule, and they would have to wear that to identify these people. Now, this is starting to head towards discrimination, and often the two can be combined as well. Okay? So, what we have here is legal limitations will fail if we don't have popular culture support and enforcement. So, what we can do is we can basically try to do what Bulgaria did and not actually produce enough yellow badges for these Jewish people to wear them. And as a result of that, 80% of Jewish people did not wear them. So basically, it didn't have any significance. So what countries can do, if we're in the symbolization stage, as a preventative measure, is stop giving these symbols the power that these groups are seeking to empower them with. So if you don't recognize them, you don't support them, the idea of symbolization loses all meaning and power over these people. Discrimination, hopefully you're all clear with what discrimination means. It can be active, like segregation, or it can be inbuilt into legislation as well. So forcing people to have their citizenship stripped, have their employment removed if they're in a certain part of public service or something like that, like in university or the government or in schools. And this discrimination grows and grows. So we're here in the Rohingya, in the Burma, they didn't have citizenship. So automatically we're seeing what we set up here as well, classification and symbolization alongside discrimination. The next stage is dehumanization. And this is basically the first real step towards enabling people's mindset to change so they can justify the genocide when it happens later, the extermination stage. Basically, we see one group, the controlling group, turn the other group into something other than human. So often this will be with something that we don't like as humans, say vermin or insects or diseases or animals in some cases. Now, we've seen this in the slavery trade in America and the African Americans that were taken across from various areas in Africa. Basically, they were said to be furniture, right? So they were bought, they were sold, they could be treated not as humans. So we see this process as a really important part of genocide and a quite scary one because this is how we justify doing awful things to these people as a power group that would result in genocide. This is because it's easy to do something if it isn't against a person as a group. It's horrific to kill a person for a group of people, but it may not be if they consider them to be vermin, something that's causing problems in this scenario. The next stage of these 10 that we're looking at today is organization. Now, it's okay and it's one thing to have dehumanization and discrimination happen. It's another thing to actually justify it and combine that into an organization which pursues these minorities. We're starting to see militias built up in Rwanda. We're starting to see decentralization, right, with terrorist groups that are created. They can be informal or they can actually be sanctioned by the state. This is a big problem because we're seeing the power condense in a certain area, and now that power, if we follow down the stages of genocide, will essentially empower these groups to exterminate the people who are already dehumanized and discriminated against. Ways that we can intervene, or the UN can intervene, is basically trying to stop any weapons or any sort of support that may be given to these countries, such as like external militias or external armies, support groups coming in, so we don't actually have the means for the genocide to take place. Now, this may be a bit futile sometimes because the country may already have this within its sovereign state borders, or the UN may not be in a position to actually stop this, but this is a way that we can work towards imposing preventative methods to stop it progressing to the next stage. Next, we have polarization, and this is where everything starts ramping up. This is basically spewing propaganda, and it's all fueled by extremists. We no longer just have the moderates running, the people who hate. We now have the people who hate and are willing to commit violent acts to basically push these people out of their space, whether it's their country, their state, or their living areas, or just out of existence altogether. So this polarization was quite effective, if you want to consider it to be effective, in Rwanda with the genocide there, when over radio, this constant barrage of extremist propaganda essentially was drowning out any voices of reason or those people who would stop them. Ways that we can prevent this is basically trying to get moderate leaders to have the power and to shift the focus away from extremists so that we have people with moderate views who are unlikely to escalate it to genocide. Also, coup d'etats by extremists that are happening, that is like revolutions or takeovers, should be opposed by international sanctions. So if this is happening and an extremist group or an extremist individual is leading this revolution, the UN has the responsibility to stop this from happening so they don't seize power and move on to the next stage of preparation and then finally heading towards extermination. What we have now is preparation, and we see that as a 7th step, so we're almost to the 10th step, and the 9th step actually being extermination itself. Preparation is basically planning this genocide. So no longer is it just a fancy or a fantasy that they have that they wish to remove these people. They will actually plan it. They will build armies, purchase weapons, and create this mindset of not only us and them, but it's us, and if we don't act now, they will do something awful to us. So it's starting to capitalize upon that hate that's been built up all through these steps so far in the 6 previous steps. And we see a real mobilization of these forces in preparation for heading to persecution and extermination. So arms embargoes can be a good way to prevent these preparation actions happening, as well as commissions to enforce these arms embargoes as well. If we can stop the weapons and the other armies and militias and stuff getting into the country, it may and hopefully will limit the impact that these groups have upon the marginalized minority. What we have now is number 8, persecution. So now we're actually seeing death lists created. We're starting to basically force the symbols to be worn, otherwise consequences of death or imprisonment, but likely death, will happen. We see people pushed off their land. They're segregated into ghettos. They're put into concentration camps, or they're put somewhere that has a famine with no food and intentionally starved off so that they all die. We start seeing genocidal massacres beginning. They intentionally destroy a part of the group, therefore they are considered to be genocide, and persecution is where we start seeing this actually occurring. At this stage, the UN must consider this to be a genocide emergency, and it must be activated. That's when we start bringing in alliances, we start bringing in other nations and the might of the UN to intervene as quickly as possible. The Security Council steps in at this point, looks at arming international intervention, and basically trying to assist the minority in stopping these genocidal massacres. The second last step is the extermination itself. So it's no longer small groups of genocide happening. It's actually a concerted effort of trying to eliminate an entire group of people. At this stage, like it says on the 4th line here, only a rapid and overwhelming armed intervention can stop genocide. Safe areas need to be created that are guarded by these groups, and these groups must ensure that they cease the genocide that is currently happening. This is where the UN can get directly involved with armed troops. The Security Council can agree to send certain troop forces. And then if the UN itself is paralyzed by infighting or bigger problems happening around the world, local regional armies or city states or sovereign states, whatever you want to call them, must intervene to stop this happening. The final step, even though you may have thought extermination was the final step, is denial. So basically, the genocide has happened. Uh, Perpetrators of genocide dig up the mass graves, burn the bodies, and try to cover the evidence up and intimidate the witnesses. So what we have here is a concerted effort to basically lie about what happened and to sweep it under the rug. People have been killed, and this is the attempt to escape any sort of blame or any sort of consequences as a result of this. What we can do as citizen states of the world is basically try to get some sort of justice through the International Criminal Court and Court of Justice. We can hold specific tribunals to bring these people to justice or international tribunals as well. But we must arrest these people, prosecute them, and ensure that we gather the right amount of evidence to support conviction and have these countries support them as well. So this is the document that walks us through the 10 stages. These are the ones that we're going to focus with as a class. I'm going to switch across back now to our slideshow. And what you'll be able to see is the final part of our slideshow. So we're going to bounce back to this idea of colonization. Now, we've talked about this. We've talked about the many countries that have colonization strategies through the last 100, 200, 300 years. Primarily, you'll be aware of England and the British Empire. That was a result of colonization. But a lot of countries have colonies across the world or have had colonies. And we've actually talked about in class the damage that this has resulted in for the landscape, for Indigenous people of different countries, and for mass immigration into areas that may not sustain that. What we have here is a political cartoon. You know, as part of my teaching, I love showing you these. That is because even though they are social or political comments, they really come down to what we look at in international relations and in legal studies. It's amazing how instead of reading a 10,000 word article, you can actually look at this picture with a bit of context and with a bit of background and be able to understand something from a simple single image. Something quite complex as well. So what we have here is with the title of The Mad Scramble for Africa, we have representations of a number of countries, each trying to pull Africa apart. What this represents, and you'll do a bit of research into this in a second, this represents the colonization of Africa and the resulting damage that has been caused all over the continent. We have many countries, not just Britain, but we have Belgium, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, each searching for a different part of Africa. As you can see in this image, each of those countries have different areas that they have colonized within Africa. So even though there were people there before and nations that existed for a long, long time, we have these countries coming in and trying to claim parts of Africa prior to World War I. Here you can see Rwanda, and this is going to be our focus for the rest of this genocide subtopic. We are going to be looking at the Rwandan genocide, and you will be watching Hotel Rwanda as part of your studies as well. So as you can see on this map, Rwanda is essentially central in the sort of the south of Africa. It's surrounded by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, of Burundi, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda as well. So we have a number of countries around Rwanda, and Rwanda is quite small, considering we've got the Congo there, we've got Algeria, Libya, Angola, all of these larger nations. Rwanda is quite tiny. So looking at Rwanda, we can actually see that compared to Australia and Tasmania, it has an incredible, a smaller landmass, but a significant amount of people. So Rwanda is 1/3 almost of Tasmania's size, and yet has 12.6 million people compared to Tasmania's 500,000. So the density of population is incredibly high, 480 people per square kilometre, whereas Australia and Tasmania are only 3.1 and 7.5 respectively. The infant mortality is incredibly high as well. In Australia, it's only 4.3 per thousand people. That means 4.3 infants die per 1,000 people, whereas in Rwanda it is 58.19. So incredibly high population density on a small landmass with a high infant mortality rate. So in 1993, we had the UN essentially failing to peacekeep in Somalia. We see the UN involved as well, and these failures to essentially stop this conflict from happening and having to suffer the consequences within it. This led to something called the Clinton Doctrine, which was essentially the USA withdrawing back into itself, but also in saying on a world context that it was important to intervene and to stop these horrific things from happening. So, a bit of background for Rwanda. So, prior to World War One, so we're looking at prior to 1914, the area that is now known as Rwanda was actually under Belgium's control. There were two groups there. The Hutu and the Tutsi. The Hutu were the majority. They had made up 85% of the population. So that means that the Tutsi were only 15%. That's important to keep that in mind. The Belgians actually preferred the minority of people, that is the Tutsis, because they appeared to be more Anglo like the Belgians. Now, the Belgians left the Tutsi minority in charge when they left, and independence was given to Rwanda, but tension and violence actually started before this. Rwanda did have a significant civil war from independence, and this caused a major conflict between the two groups of people. So before we go to that, the Hutus actually had control and were in charge. And this is the really strange part. The Hutus had control of Rwanda, essentially under the Belgians, but when the Belgians left, they left the Tutsis in charge. Now, you can understand why this might be a bit of a problem, considering the power imbalance and the sudden switch. So, as we get towards the movie that we're going to watch and towards the genocide, the incumbent president, in the name there you can see, Habyarimana, began losing popularity. Tutsi refugees in Uganda, supported by moderate Hutus, were reforming something called the RPF, or the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Their aim was to overthrow this president and secure their right to return. The president chose to exploit this threat as a way of bringing dissident Hutus back to his side, and Tutsis inside Rwanda were accused of being collaborators with this RPF group. After a number of conflicts in 1993, during August, months of negotiation were happening. A peace accord was signed between the president and RPF, but the conflict and the unrest continued. Just because there was a peace accord, that is like a treaty written agreeing peace between the groups, didn't mean that that conflict magically disappeared. So they signed this peace treaty. They signed to agree how to share the power. The UN entered Rwanda, basically allowing this peace agreement to happen and supporting them as they headed towards that peace solution. This was good at the UN. The UN was quite proficient at mentoring the situation. However, it all sort of flew out of control when the Hutu president actually was killed in a plane crash when it was shot down. The presidential guard, that is the people who protected the president, part of the military, initiated a campaign of retribution. The leaders of the political opposition were slaughtered, killed, murdered, and almost immediately we have this elimination and slaughter of the Tutsis and of any moderate Hutus. Propaganda was spewed out, as well as the presidential guard. The Interahamwe militia group, which was not supported by the government overtly or officially, basically was mobilized and had 30,000 members. Over the next few months, from April to July, we see almost 1 million people killed in Rwanda. People were massacred by nationalist Hutus. They killed these moderate Hutus and Tutsis as well. So we'd actually seen the build-up to genocide happen quite rapidly. And then as soon as the president was killed, this campaign of retribution and genocide occurred. So at this point, I'm going to get you to go and try to find Hotel Rwanda. I am going to try to find how I can give it to you or guide you to it. When you've watched it, can you please come back here and we'll have a conversation about it? Okay. So could we have actually stopped this Rwanda genocide that you saw in Hotel Rwanda from happening? Considering it was on a small landmass and considering it was up to 1 million people, it was highly likely that we could have stopped this genocide from happening. Studies have shown that the US, even with a small military force, could probably have stopped the genocide in 3 days. And if you remember before, we were talking about how it took a number of months to actually occur. The RPF took 3 months to arrive from outside of Rwanda to support those people who were being murdered because they were on foot, and it took a number of months to get there. Prior to the president actually being shot down and killed, the UN was actually aware of these weapon stores being built up and the problems around it as well. The rules of engagement stopped the UN from entering the conflict. This was a civil war, essentially. It was only when it suddenly escalated to genocide that the UN realized that it was not just a civil war, but by that point it was too late. There was also conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well. So this is something that was not just contained within Rwanda. All right, you've seen the movie, hopefully. So let me just move this webcam for you so you can see what's going on. So it is based on real characters and events. Essentially, these did happen. These events did happen with Paul Ruzabunga, the hotel manager of this hotel, hid a number of refugees from the militia that you saw in the movie. All right. I will give you an activity rather than a coot, simply because a coot probably won't work when you're working remotely. But this is the steps towards genocide that we've seen through the stages, through the example of Rwanda, and they're talking about colonization and the effect it has had upon not only Rwanda, but many nations around the world. I'm going to give you some activities now to consolidate your knowledge, to really show you how the stages can be applied to a different scenario, as well as Rwanda, and get you thinking about the UN's role within genocide specifically. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.